there might be other people that would come in anyway. Good morning and welcome to our special AARP Coffee and Conversation. I'm your host, Kathy Hoey, and a volunteer from AARP New Hampshire. Please note that we are recording today's session, and we can talk about that after the fact. Before we start, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items in an effort to eliminate background noise. Jeannie had just brought it up. Please be sure to mute your line by ensuring the microphone icon has a line through it at the bottom left part of your computer page. But we'd love to hear from you. So if you want to ask a question, please use the chat box, which can be accessed by clicking the chat button at the bottom of your page and then writing in the question on the right hand of your page. Bev Cotton, our volunteer, is monitoring the chat and will raise your questions throughout the program. At AARP, we have been promoting the health and well-being of older adults for over 60 years. AARP's unwavering commitment to the LGBTQ+ community reflects its core belief in the dignity, worth, and potential of every individual. AARP rejects discrimination based on person's age, race, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, or gender identity. We see diversity as not a reason for division, but a source of strength. For AARP, the LGBTQ+ community are a vital part of the quilt of American life. Joining our conversation this morning is Erica Allen, the president of the PFLAG in New Hampshire. Ms. Allen was born and raised in New Jersey before moving to Concord, New Hampshire with her wife in 1997, but spending many years living in France and Oregon. They have 2 children and a grandson. She works as an information technology manager at the state of New Hampshire, where she manages a team of 20 technicians who administer security, email, identity, and data access for over 10,000 state New Hampshire employees. Early in her life, she worked as a professional chef and as an activist for environmental causes. To this day, she continues to be passionate about food and entertaining. She loves baseball, yoga, foosball, pool, and darts. Welcome, Erica, and thank you for joining us this morning. We appreciate your coming. Please, I'm going to jump right in and ask about PFLAG. PFLAG provides education and support to parents, children, family, and friends of the LGBTQ folks who may be coming to their own terms with coming out or about their loved ones. Can you please tell the audience a little bit more about the vital resource in New Hampshire of PFLAG? So take it away, Erica.
Sure.
Yeah. Go for it.
Good morning, everybody. To answer your question about PFLAG, just a little bit about the national organization. We are all over the country. We have over 400 chapters, about 200,000 members and supporters. And we started back in the early 70s, 1972, 73, thanks to the work of Jean Manford, she conceived the idea for PFLAG as a response to her son was beaten by the police. Her son Morty was beaten by the police while distributing pamphlets for the gay and lesbian movement back then. And she rightfully was very upset by that and started to organize she was on TV, on the radio, writing letters, she got very active. And she, in 72, she marched in the, it was actually called the Christopher Street. It wasn't called Pride. It was named after Christopher Street in Manhattan. So that's how far back it goes before it was even called Pride. And there she carried a sign. And it was to the effect of parents and family in support of gays and lesbians. And from that, the response was so positive that she decided to work with other family to start PFLAG. We started in New Hampshire in 1986. And today we have 4 chapters located in Concord, Manchester, Portsmouth, and Nashua. Nashua is our newest one. And for now, we are just like you guys, we're online as a result of COVID. And one of the benefits of having gone online is that our reach is greater. I've actually had people join us from Georgia, many people from Massachusetts, people from Maine, and all over New Hampshire. And so the important work that we do, it's really, we have a trifold mission. The one that I think speaks most loudly to me is the support work that we do. We provide peer support groups online for these 4 locations and hopefully someday back in person. We provide a safe, confidential space for people who are looking to connect with others who maybe have shared their experiences, whether it be parents of children who are LGBTQ, whether it be people in the community themselves. A lot of these people who come here are coming here because, and for some it's their first exposure, or they found out their child is trans or gay, and they are looking for resources and for shared experience to help them navigate through understanding their children, their family, their friends. And most of the people who come to this are there because they're trying to find a way to support their loved one. And that work that I've seen us do, I know, and it saves lives.
Mhm.
I have seen people in those organizations who are so obviously struggling for acceptance and to be welcomed and for a way forward in a society that's not always very welcoming and accepting. And I have just seen some of the most powerful moments in my life in those meetings. So that is, to me, the work that we do that is most valuable. It's not to say the other work we don't do is valuable, it's quite valuable. Another part of our mission is to do advocacy, a bit like I'm doing here, reaching out beyond the community to share what PFLAG does, to share as much as possible understanding about our community, and to work to make a difference. And then hand in glove with that is education and outreach. You might call, this is probably more appropriately education outreach, because the advocacy work we do also is with the governments of the state and with organizations throughout the state, throughout the country, to move this country into a better place of acceptance and justice for the community. So that is sort of a thumbnail of what we do. And I think it fits very well with the inclusivity statement that you talked about, Kathy.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm been thinking about this. I know we don't have a lot of time.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought I would offer you options as to how you might want to do this. I do have a glossary of terms. Sometimes there are people who just are not familiar with a lot of the terminology that we frequently use in our community. It can be confusing, mysterious.
Mm-hmm.
And then I notice this is called a coffee and talk, if you will. So we can either, if you want to just have an open dialogue, if you have questions, if you want to know, I'm very open about my life. Anybody who's heard me speak has probably heard me share quite a bit of information about myself. I do that because I think it helps people understand the struggles of especially the trans community.
So maybe we could pause and see if anybody has any questions, perhaps.
I think, yeah, so far I've seen just a lot of questions, well, actually more comments about being surprised that there were multiple chapters in New Hampshire, and that there is what seems to be a strong amount of support, which is encouraging to hear. I'm sure that could always be a bigger number, but
Mhm.
I agree with that observation. So we have our support groups. I've been going to myself to PFLAG support groups starting in Concord, where I was literally 5 blocks from where I live. I didn't know it was there, even though it was right around the corner from me. It's in a United Methodist Church. And so when I was actually starting to look for a support group like that, I was very pleased that there was one so close. I have noticed in the 3 years I've been there that there's been a bit of a resurgence. I know that early on when PFLAG New Hampshire first started, it grew fairly quickly. There was back in the 80s and 90s, there was a strong need to support the gay and lesbian community. And they did wonderful work there. And now, as you're sure most people have seen, we're kind of going through a repeat cycle now with the trans and non-binary communities, where it's a whole new exposure to people on the LGBTQ spectrum or the queer community, which queer can encompass all of that. And it's easier to say than that alphabet soup. And so we have an awful lot. I'm sure if you're paying attention to this at all, it's all over the news. You know, it's all over the media,
especially right now. Yeah.
And there's a lot of controversy surrounding it, just like there was with the gay and lesbian community 30 and 40 years ago, and even longer.
So Erica, so can we go to the next part, which is, as a trans woman, you have experienced on the front lines in the battle for acceptance and equality. Would you be willing to share some of your story with us and some of your struggles and successes to help us better understand the community and loved ones? And we can start with your story if that's what you're interested and willing to do, and then talk about the terms. But,
yes, I'm very happy to go through my story. Marcia, I beg your forgiveness. I know she's heard variations on this, so don't be bored, Marcia. And
I think, yeah.
Oh, okay, you heard it too. So if you heard it,
you know, Pride was very great on Saturday. Yeah,
oh,
you were great,
good.
Fantastic. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. So I will let me go through that and save the questions, and this narrative will give you a pretty rich idea of what it is you're asking for answers to. So let me just bring that up, and without further ado.
Indeed.
Okay.
Take some water, yeah.
People often ask me, when did you first know you were trans? And that turns out to be a difficult question to answer. It presupposes some level of understanding of gender identity, which as a young child was beyond me. And in general, good information was not easily accessible, and the subject itself was taboo. I learned about gender identity from observation and experience over a lifetime. And what I did learn was defined by rigid social and cultural beliefs. It was decades before I managed to winnow out fiction from fact and begin to make sense of myself. As a toddler, I started to notice differences between the women and the men in my family, many of which were very stereotypically traditional. My mother and my sister dressed in exciting and colorful ways. My mother was gentle and nurturing, while my father was strong and imposing. She kept house and he ruled it. She tended to the domestic chores while he worked in his study or tinkered in his workshop. She stayed home, he taught at university. And it was those early experiences that influenced my perspective on gender as I was growing up. And in the years before grade school, as I began to explore my world, I was quite unaware that I was on a collision course with a perplexing prescription for how I was expected to behave and express myself. My parents throughout my early childhood admonished me regarding my feminine expressions. And to me, they were no different than anything else I was learning as far as limits as a child. Her telling me, my mother telling me not to play with her clothes was to me no different really than her telling me not to touch a hot stove. And over time, I was slowly being taught to behave like my brother, although I wasn't aware of it, didn't realize it. And I mean, my brother and my sister were over 10 years older than I was. And I didn't have exposure to other children, so I didn't know what they were going through. And I had no idea my parents were correcting my behavior to such a significant degree. I trusted them and wanted to please them. And I knew that they loved me and wanted the best for me. I could sense that something was off, and there was something about me that made them uncomfortable. And that definitely made me uneasy. And so in the traditional binary perspective, that I think my parents were influenced by, or that's what they knew. Boys and men are at one end of the gender spectrum, and girls and women are at the opposite. But the truth is, or at least my experience was that the gulf between them is wide, and the rules for behaving like one or the other are endless. You may not perceive it that way, but when you feel like you're at one end of the spectrum and people think you're at the other, getting over there was a lot of work, nonstop. It didn't feel right. It felt awkward, uncomfortable, but I didn't know otherwise. And so I did my best. It was in grade school that I started to recognize that there was something different about me. I was surrounded by boys and girls my age, and I couldn't help notice pretty obvious differences. Boys had their bathrooms, girls had their bathrooms, boys played their sports, girls played their sports, clothing was different. It goes on, but those were right off the bat, very obvious differences. Boys were also more aggressive, and size, strength, and speed, made a difference into how much you were respected. And I thought girls seemed calmer, softer, and to my liking, they were chattier. And another thing I noticed is that it was okay for girls to like art and music. And as a boy, if you like those things, it didn't go so well. And so as I was going through grade school, you began to learn, especially as you got into the upper elementary school, 3rd, 4th, 5th grade, that boys, it was best if you're a boy to be with the boys, and if you're a girl to be with the girls. And if you cross over those lines, it could cause confusion and sometimes problems. So the other thing that I realized early on was that I was expected to behave like the boys, which was, again, it made me feel very uncomfortable. And I did everything I could to spend as much time with the girls, as much as I dared. And I mean, I didn't know anybody like me. This was back, I'm easily age to be a member of AARP. I'm almost 60. And so back then I didn't know anybody like me, and I didn't have any words for me. And I was starting to get afraid that people would figure out about this weird thing inside of me of feeling like a girl. And so what I did is focused on school, kept to a very small circle of friends I think I felt safe with. And I was glad that I was perceived more like a teacher's pet bookworm, nerd, which is a whole lot better than being perceived as a sissy, which I had occasion to run into kids calling me that and things like that. As I got older and I went through adolescence, I began to deal with the horrific onset of puberty, where now skin, hair, odor, features, they started to change in ways that were horrifying to me. The worst was to hear my voice deepen. And it was the first time really, if you're not familiar with this term, gender dysphoria hit me. And that, for those who don't know what that is, it's a feeling of great discomfort, disturbance between how you feel and what you have for a body. I mean, I just like felt like I was completely in the wrong place inside of me, and I could never get away from it. I even tried silly things to hold it back. Like early on as a teenager, I was shaving all my body hair just to try to stop it, and that just made it worse. It just made me feel that much different, weirder, wrong compared to everybody else. By the time I got to high school, I had enough practice now being around boys and girls to to feel relatively safe, to fit in, to fake it. But then high school made it a whole lot worse because two big things came into play as I was, advancing through adolescence into young adulthood. Sexuality was starting to kick in, and I was had these feelings that were coming on scared the hell out of me because I was afraid of them, and afraid to engage with my peers. I was pretty confused, and then the other difference is that in elementary school, the kids start to separate into boys and girls. In high school, they start to come back together again as they develop interest in each other. And I had no idea how to engage in those, I considered them quite mysterious rituals. And there's no way I was going to act on how I felt toward anybody. And then on top of that, I also began to realize that I was attracted to both sexes. And this was back in the 80s. Which I know in this crowd, most people will remember. That was a scary time to feel that. And so I was socially paralyzed, I was awkward, and I avoided parties, things like that. The saving grace was that at that age, most kids are pretty awkward, and a lot of the kids felt the same way for their own reasons. And so I don't think too many people really noticed. When I was 18, my dad said something. He said, "If you turn out to be gay, I won't have anything to do with you." And that awoken in me a fear that was stronger than anything I'd felt before. I felt like my connection to family was suddenly at risk. I wondered, well, what did he know? And I also wondered what I had done. And more than anything else, I was wondering why he was so angry. And, just as in the past and as would continue in the future, it was just another moment that terrified me that I would lose connection with people that actually I cared about, loved, and knew. And so I had already been in hiding, as you can tell, and it just drove me deeper into hiding. And by the time I got to college, it was pretty clear that anybody that seemed anything like me, they were kept on the margins, and they were stereotyped, and they were vilified. And there was a community in the college town, Rutgers, where I was, on the other side of town, where you could have some exposure to the community. I even went to New York City because it was just up the road for me in New Jersey. And even there, all I saw, all I could really see were transvestites and drag queens. And I just, I didn't feel like that. I mean, I didn't feel flamboyant. So I still was without any sense of anybody like me. I just really began to think there was something very, very wrong with me. And it didn't help that I also learned that in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, that the psychiatric profession deemed that I and others like me were mentally ill. And so by the time I left college, I was really sure that there was something wrong with me. But I was lucky. A few years later, I met and I fell in love with, and I finally married a wonderful woman. That was 32 years ago, August 12th. And I kind of believed that my love for her would overcome my internal feelings. And we began to build a life together. We started our careers, we started a family, and life was actually pretty good. But I did learn over the next 25 years that this thing that I was trying to hide, it was impossible to hide. And really what I learned was that being a man was nothing but a constant struggle with tension, repressed anger, and difficulty connecting with others. And though I wished to, and I tried to find joy in marriage and children, I couldn't. And I just grew into a moody, controlling, impatient, and resentful husband and father. In fact, throughout that part of my life, being in my 20s and 30s and into my 40s, I felt like a deep cover spy If you ever watch the show The Americans, I felt like there's two Russians who were immersed in American culture, and they even raised kids who had no idea they were Russian spies. That's how I felt. I felt like I was perpetually in hiding. Yet inside of me, there was this feeling that I couldn't ignore. It just kept clawing at me. And so as a result of that, my confidence pretty much withered to nothing. And I also felt incredibly dishonest. And so I just slipped into Great Depression. But at the same time, I was also beginning to recognize that this thing inside me was in fact me, and I was trying to kill it. So by my late 40s, while outward appearances, I seemed fine. Inside, I was in turmoil, and I had reached a dangerous point when I had decided that if I finished out my life never having lived, there was no point in living. And I struggled with this for a year. I practiced ways, but I struggled with it and thought about it and just wrestled with it in my head. And though I was desperate and ready, I knew I didn't want to die, but I couldn't tolerate not being alive. And so it was at this point in my late 40s that I chose to transition. I knew it would be the hardest thing I would ever do. I had no idea how my future would play out, where I would land, and what sacrifices I'd have to make. And I had been married by then for about 25 years. I had 2 young adult children. I was far along in a successful career. I had a close network of close friends, and I was pretty well established in my community. But in my mind, all of this was at risk. And this is a great fear of trans people that they struggle with when they want to claim their identity. To do that, to make that choice, is to understand that you might lose much or all that is dear to you. It took me 6 years to go through transition, and I had determined, I'm pig-headed, to preserve everything that I cherished. I didn't want to lose my marriage, my family. I didn't want to jeopardize my career, and I did not want to end up alienated and miserable. And so I resolved not to give in to the idea that I should have to give up so much just to be me. And also, as I began this journey, it was with a growing belief that it was not I who had a problem, but society. And today I'm sure of that. I had no idea what the journey would be like, how I'd get there, or wherever that was, or what to expect. I just knew I had to move in a feminine direction and to do it cautiously. I didn't think to get support, guidance, and there were no role models, and I just went out on my own, swapping out the fear of discovery for the fear of the unknown. So I first came out to strangers, people I didn't know, because there was really nothing at stake if they rejected me, but eventually I had to come out to family and friends. And I was sure those relationships would end, and for those around me who were close to me, it was a bumpy and sometimes painful road to acceptance. And I was always sure something would go wrong. So I don't have enough time to go through the whole process, but I can share 2 of the approaches I adopted during that time. The first was to commit to always having as much consideration for those around me as I hoped they would have for me. I recoiled at the notion of entitlement, that it was my right to transition and everyone had better accept it. Sure, it is my right, but it was not an approach I was comfortable with. And the second was to commit to face every day a new fear. I mean, thinking back on it, I realized that it was easier to face the fear of small change than of drastic change. And each small success also helped me develop mental toughness and confidence, going out every day, challenging kind of norms of how you're supposed to look, thinking that, wondering how people are going to react. I got used to that. And after a while, I didn't care. And I found over time, to my amazement, that, people at work, my community, my friends, and most importantly, my family were able to accept me, respect me, support me, care about me, and sometimes even admire me, which, you know, is way more than I ever expected. And so today I'm mostly liberated from the pain and anxiety and all those things I used to feel. And I still have my family. My wife and I are about to celebrate 32 years. And I still have my friends, and I've actually gotten a promotion in my job, and I'm still very involved in my community. But I have to say, just because I had a happy outcome, don't be fooled. Even after what might seem like a happy outcome, life can be much better, but it is rarely easy. There are often serious issues with mental health, frequent challenges with acceptance, and significant obstacles to economic success. Trans people, myself included, often suffer from mental illnesses, such as severe anxiety, depression, eating disorders. Rejection by family and friends is not uncommon, and careers may be forever set back. And for those in society who are accepting, transgender people remain such an enigma that their eagerness to demonstrate support often compels them to inadvertently shine a spotlight on our differences with inappropriate questions and comments that are actually intended to convey support. And so we're continually reminded of our difference, even by the best intentioned people.
Indeed. Thank you, Erica. I think we do have some other questions in the chat.
Sure.
Yes, we do. Well, just to stay here for a minute, Kathy was asking if you had support from a lot. Did you have any significant support from others during your transition, and did you receive medical services for transition here in New Hampshire?
But yes to both. So within, as I stated, my family, my wife was amazing. She did not take to this naturally, but she is an amazing person. What was most amazing about her, she was able to question her own way of thinking. That's not easy for people to do. And she was also able to see past my expression into me and still realize I was still there. In the medical community, we had tremendously good quality marital counseling. I would say that without that marital counseling, and I'm going to give a shout out to Sean Hassel. I'm trying to remember the name of the place in Manchester. I'll get it back later, but and he's not the only one. There are good counselors out there. The problem is, and COVID just made it 10 times worse. It's very, very, very hard to obtain good counseling. It's just that there are not enough resources. You know, that extends way beyond our community, but so that is hard. I also had an individual counselor. She's since retired. Her name is Ann Bodecker, and she is a titan in the field of counseling and support for the trans community. She's actually written the transgender guidebook, which is available on Amazon, and it's a tremendously valuable tool to help people who are trans and their support group understand from both a scientific perspective, a mental perspective, and a social perspective, and an individual perspective, what those challenges are like, explains, you know, what's going on. It demystifies the science behind it, and it's a tremendously valuable resource for validating the community and helping others understand. There are, of course, support groups that are tremendously valuable, and there's a ton of different kinds of support groups. The community, and I was lucky, I think I came into needing support at a time when support was really starting to make a lot of progress. That manual I told you about, the DSM for short, you know, it was only, I think, about in 2015 that they rewrote this part of it and said, no, being trans is not a mental disorder. But having gender dysphoria associated with not being able to claim your identity, that is a mental disorder. And the cure for it is to help somebody through transition. And so that's a very, very different diagnosis than saying you're sick for feeling the way you do, rather than saying you feel bad because your society doesn't accept you and you are stuck in a place that's very wrong for you. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah.
If you want to follow up, please do.
Well, as you say, helping, being helpful to someone during their transition, there's a question very much related to that. Jeannie has a trans nephew who her family continually dead names. And how can she be a better ally and advocate for him and encourage her family to accept him for who he is? She does constantly correct them when they refer to him as she, but her comments and wisdom don't seem to be getting through.
There's multiple ways to help with that. One, does this family, do they participate in any of the support groups out there? I'm thinking right now of PFLAG, because PFLAG welcomes all ages and everybody who's around an LGBTQ loved one into it, because there it accomplishes a lot of things. Often, if you're a parent of somebody who's trans, you can feel stigmatized. You can feel like, oh, my child, there's something wrong with my child. You can feel like you want to suppress it, and you can feel ill-equipped to cope with it. Support groups are tremendously valuable for sharing the experiences of others who have found productive ways forward. And you also learn, that when you dead name somebody, there's different ways of dead naming. Intentional dead naming is poison. When you refuse to accept somebody in the way they identify themselves and revert to their previous pronouns or name, that is poison. Doing it unintentionally is quite different, and it's but there has to be some kind of commitment to moving forward. Don't beat yourself up if you make the mistake. Acknowledge it. And when that person tells you, by the way, it's she or whatever, take it. Allow yourself that mistake. And I completely agree with that child to correct every single time, because those old habits are very, very hard to break. And the only way to break them is every single time it's that little reminder. Every time you do it, you're not getting away with it. And that's so important. But being in a support group where you can hear how other parents have dealt with it and how it helps to come to a point of greater acceptance when you feel like you're not alone or unique in this challenge. There's so many of us out there with families who want to help. And they also might want to consider counseling for themselves. And it's got to be the right counselor. It has to be a counselor who knows how to support the trans community in a productive way. Because there are people out there who are either poorly equipped or have some very old-fashioned notions. There's fewer and fewer because the community is, as a whole, moving in the right direction for supporting the appropriate health measures for people in the trans community. Embracing them as valid, complex individuals.
I like that.
I think parents and families need to work if they love their family, because going through transition without the support of family can be literally deadly. And it can certainly lead to, and I know that a lot of parents, and I'm sorry to expound, but this is really important. A lot of parents, this is true of my father. It wasn't so much that my father couldn't accept me for being whatever he was afraid I was. It was that he was afraid for me. Especially back then, he just thought that if I turned out to be anything other than a straight white male, then my life would be hard. I would suffer. I would probably not have success. And he was right. The problem with that, and thank God it's less right today because society's come a long ways and still has a long ways to go. Repressing that inner person is far more damaging than trying to help people find a way through and support them. It's not necessarily ever going to be easy going forward, but it's far less harmful to support somebody moving forward than it is to try to hold them back.
Can I just say, I do think that I did a little talk about gay and lesbian, trans, LGBTQ communities back in Cambridge, Mass. And one of the things that we found was that there was still a very high rate of suicide amongst, for everybody, but especially with the trans community, and also a higher rate of violence against the trans community as well. And we're still fighting those battles, and that's something that's, needs to be acknowledged, and also, and we really need to put some emphasis on that as well, and helping people through the transitions and giving them the support they need to deal with all of that external pressure that's going on, as well as the internal pressure. Anyway, I want to thank you. I think go ahead.
I just wanted to ask quickly a little bit of help with terminology.
Okay, shoot.
There was a question that someone asked to how to better understand the non-binary community. And I personally had a question. When I was growing up, I'm in my late 60s. When I was growing up, the word queer was a very derogatory and negative term. And I hesitate to use that term even today because it's uncomfortable for me, because I feel like I'm being negative and disrespectful and harmful in some way.
So a good question, and very nuanced consideration of the word queer. Non-binary, that's one of the terms I was thinking of. It's an adjective that describes people who don't identify exclusively as a man or a woman. And that's what that term binary is. Binary is you're all man, you're all woman. And it's now, conventional psychological wisdom or psychiatric wisdom that it's not so black and white. There's really a spectrum from male to female, and people can land in different spots. And if you think about people you've known over your lifetime, it might actually start to make sense. There's some people who just are more less manly or less feminine than what their biology might state. And it has, by the way, this has nothing to do with gender orientation. It's expression. It's more to do with their identity. And so it basically non-binary means you're falling somewhere in between that black and white spectrum of male and female. And for a lot of people, that's just that's not how we were taught, how we were raised. It was, and you still hear that argument today. But that's what non-binary talks about or describes. And then when you talk about queer, you're absolutely right. I'm also old enough to remember that, and I mean, I was on the receiving end of it. Queer is a very pejorative term, and as often happens with some of these pejorative terms, the community reclaimed it. I don't know exactly when, but I would say within the last 5, maybe 10 years, but I'd say closer to 5 years, people are basically saying they're queer and they're proud of it, and they're not going to let somebody hurt them with that term. And so you heard me use it, I think, earlier in the talk. And so I feel like I can understand you, because for you, you've heard it used so many times, it's almost burned in. It's almost like dead naming, if you will. It feels hurtful to do it. It all depends on how you use it, and it can be tricky to do that. So for those of us in the community, it's really easy for us to do it because we've got the bona fides. We are queer, and so I'm perfectly comfortable saying it. I really respect and appreciate people who are careful about it, because there's an understanding there that it was at one time very hateful. It's a little bit like a word I can't say. I cannot ever say it, but the N word. When somebody who's not part of the community of color, the Black community of color, the African American community of color, you can never feel. It carries so much history and hate. But you also know that you hear, especially in rap music, and if you're close to the community, they endearingly refer to themselves using the N word. And so there's a sort of a parallel there, if you will. So I respect your.
Go ahead, Eric. I was going to say, I think it's important to ask the person how they identify. Yeah.
I think that's a very, very smart and safe way to go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because not everybody uses the word queer either, especially in the older LGBTQ community. So it really varies. It varies so much. Yeah.
It does. When you're used to something being that hurtful, it's like I can understand it not being easy to use it, thinking it could be not hurtful.
And I would talk about pride in Boston and all the, how it's always started with the dykes on bikes. And my sister would say to me, "You're using the word dykes. You cannot use that word." I said, "Well, that's what people they call themselves dykes on bikes, and that's the way it goes. And I can use the word, but I'm not sure that it's comfortable for other people. And certainly hearing it from somebody else who is not lesbian would probably not be feeling all that comfortable. But that, it's you have to ask people how they identify and how they feel comfortable with certain terms. So
I just want to tell you, Erica, how much I appreciate this conversation. I'm happy that you are where you are.
Thank you.
I had almost a visceral response when you were telling your story about how incredibly difficult difficult isn't even the right word, to even be in your own world, your own family, your own place, but not really know where you belonged and where you would be accepted and where that would be okay. And I just can't imagine living so many years not able to be your true self. And so I'm just it's been very impactful conversation for me. So thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Now we have to help all the others who are trying to do the same.
sure.
I just wanted to leave one last message. It's you heard the other day, Kathy, which is one of the things, and I really sense tremendous love and acceptance in this group. So I don't think this is something that would be difficult. But remember I was saying that people inadvertently shine the spotlight on us for being trans. The best way to help anybody who's in the trans community is really to treat them as a whole, complex, valid individual, and to, if you're with somebody who's trans, it's better just to be with them like you are with anybody else. If you're working with them, do your work. If you're playing with them, play. If you're make the shared engagement the focus. And it's the best thing that can happen when you're trans, at least for me, is when I'm with people and I forget I'm trans. Because we move to the point where whatever my difference is that may be obvious, whether it's my voice, it doesn't really matter. And for some, it's far more difficult for me than it is for more difficult for others than it might be for me, because I have what I call bathroom passing privileges. I can walk into a bathroom in any country I've been in. Nobody knows. But I don't have restaurant passing privileges. When I go to a restaurant, as soon as I open my mouth to order, most of the time they can tell. And so after a while, though, for me, you just put up you try to filter out that noise. And if there ever gets to a point where society is so used to us that it's just no different than anybody else having a freckle or red hair or gray hair or blue eyes or brown eyes, it's just right. It's just another characteristic of being a human as opposed to being trans, or anybody who's on the margins, whatever it is that people seem to key in on, because it's so different. And so if we can just share engagement in life and experience together, life is so much better for all of us.
And fun. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
And happy. Anyway, I think we do need to stop the video at this point. I think everybody was very pleased, and thank you for sharing your time and insights for all of us.